Hi. So this is our first reading titled as Introducing Human Rights and Literary Forms for the Vehicles and Vocabularies of Human Rights. Authors are Sophia A. McClennen and Joseph R. Slaughter. And is published in Comparative Literature Studies. In fact, this particular volume of the journal is a human rights specific volume. You should be able to access it on BU Library as well. Okay, so what is the major claim in this particular article? So at this time in 2009, when this article is published, the question of human rights is still getting traction in literary studies. So when we use this expression literary studies, by that we mean various forms of culture representations, which include literature like novel, poetry, but which also include dramas, plays, film, documentaries, and all these cultural forms of representation. So the major claim in this article is this, that human rights primarily are interlinked with language. They are inscribed in language, and therefore their capacity to get activated is made possible through language. Similarly, their capacity or their inability to be activated is also made possible with the language. So here is an interesting example to show that how it is through language that human rights work. So this is example with reference to the war on terror. If you could see right now on your screen, human rights are under threat everywhere, especially when the language of human rights is used to justify their violation. It should be remembered, for instance, that the arguments to invade Afghanistan after the World Trade Center terrorist attacks were framed from the start by a dual rhetoric of retaliatory payback and generous humanitarianism. So this was the rhetoric. If you could see, kill the evil men and save the innocent women and children was the brief. There is no better example of this doublespeak than Bush's announcement of the war. And this was the announcement. As we strike military targets, we will also drop food, medicine, and supplies to the starving and suffering men and women and children of Afghanistan. For Afghans, planes overhead could mean imminent death and destruction or much needed supplies. Right? So clearly, language is being put to a kind of doublespeak where it is being used both to invoke the potential destruction and potential humanitarianism. Now, if human rights can be fairly understood to be largely matter of culture, how is it that we can engage culture to understand human rights better? Now, so that is the major question throughout. This question can be elaborated in terms of the alternative discourse which engages with human rights. And as we probably already know, the alternative discourse that engages with human rights is the discourse of law. So as we already see it, human rights seem to have stemmed from the discourse of law. So, so are we not satisfied with the stemming of human rights from the discourse of law? Probably not. The reason for our lack of satisfaction with the rooting of human rights in the discourse of law is this, that discourse of law reduces human to a legal entity. However, the discourse of culture, where we are trying to position human rights, that discourse of culture, has the potential to treat human as human and is able to look at human entity more comprehensively. So if we read from here, for our part, we take it for granted that humanities have some bearing on human rights. The human rights are already implicated in the humanities. However, humanism may not prove to be the most satisfying basis for claiming linkages between the two, especially if we recognize that human envisioned by human rights is a creature of the law in the state. That is, the human of the law and the human of literature do not fully line up, even if they ultimately claim the same real-world referent. There is a disciplinary tendency in humanities-based human rights scholarship to ignore, devalue, or discredit the law, and there is a danger entailed in claiming human rights for the humanities if, as a consequence, human rights are reduced to some weak articulation of the Kantian categorical imperative. Now, we are right now uh, in a paradox. And the paradox is this, that human rights are neither fully taken care of by the discourse of law, nor they are being fully taken care of by the discourse of culture. Because the discourse of culture tends to present human rights as a sentimental issue, while the discourse of law treats human rights as a legal category, right? Which is too objective and without any emotions. So while we are aware of this paradox, we are also aware of the fact that the culture of human rights is more comprehensive in the sense that culture has form. And now, and this is the response to the question that I earlier raised, right? So the question is, to what extent culture or legal discourse, cultural discourse or legal discourse, to what extent can they represent human rights? The answer is that culture can probably represent human rights more effectively if we consider culture or cultural forms more than what they appear to be. So I think I already gave away a little of what the major argument is when I use the word form. So the, the, the kind of conclusive claim in this article is that we need to treat culture and cultural expressions as forms. When we treat them as forms, we can then activate those forms to leverage human rights. Now, this is a little tricky. So all cultural expressions have primarily two sides to them. One is the content. For example, if we read a novel, we have the content of the novel in the form of a plot, story, characters. But the same novel also has another side to it. It is called form. So form is the overall shape of the narrative. Is the narrative, for example, personal? Or is the narrative broken? Or is the narrative uh, a kind of dominating? Or is the narrative submissive? All cultural expressions have forms. So films have forms, poetry has form, uh, and plays have forms. So we tend to ignore the form of any given cultural text. So the conclusive claim over here is that in order to challenge the misuse and abuse of human rights in the legal category, we need to instead engage with the cultural forms, the forms of the cultural expression. We need to engage with the forms of the cultural expressions about human rights. And it is because it is the forms which in fact challenge the social order. So if you read these lines from here, how often do we show a film or read a testimonial in human rights classes, whether social sciences, science oriented or humanities based, where only the plot and themes are discussed? What are we missing when such texts are taught with little or no attention to the forms of their expression? If there has been one ongoing thread in humanities research in the past 3 decades, it is that culture cannot be understood without reference to the politics of representation. Symbolic forms, societal context, representational meanings are intimately tied to relations of power. The rich and messy nexus formed by political representation and the politics of representation that is at the center of human rights issues demands attention not only to the intersections between culture and law, but also to the ways that these discourses make and unmake meaning. So when we pay attention to the form of cultural expressions, we basically pay attention to the politics of cultural expression. And when we pay attention to the politics of cultural expression, we in fact pay attention to the power structure, power dynamic in which these cultural forms engage. So this is the major claim in this article. Please read through it to make better sense of it and let me know if you have any question.